Well, good morning again. Thank you for being with us this morning. And because I want to make the best use of the time we have together, we'll go ahead and just get started. We're going to end up in Romans 10:8, where I read from this morning. Our primary passage is going to be Romans chapter 10, verses 1 through 4. Before we get there, I want us to have some background information and build into that. So I want to ask the question, do you have a zeal for God? And you may be asking, what does it mean to be zealous? What does it mean to have a zeal for God? The definition of zeal is a great energy or enthusiasm in pursuit of a cause or objective. Synonyms would be to have a passion or devotion, to have a love for something or someone. So do you have a passion for God? Do you have enthusiasm for God? Do you love God? And this morning, I want us to understand that we are commanded to have a zeal for God. Deuteronomy chapter 6, Moses has just given the Ten Commandments for the second time. And I know we've been looking at them together on Sunday mornings out of Exodus 20, but in Deuteronomy 6, he gives them the second time, and that's what Deuteronomy means. Deuteros means second, and nomos meaning law. It's the second giving of the law. And Moses follows up the Ten Commandments in Deuteronomy with this in chapter 6, verse 5. It says, "Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your strength." So we have a commandment from God that we're supposed to be zealous for Him. But the problem that we fall into sometimes is we have a zeal, but our zeal is misplaced. It's something else that we're really zealous for. And that's what we're going to be looking at today in Romans chapter 10. But before we get to our main passage, I think we need to understand what the Apostle Paul is writing about, why he's writing it, who he's writing to, and from the perspective of which he's writing it. And he emphasizes a lot in these chapters, Romans 9, 10, 11, and even 12, his kinsmen according to the flesh. He's talking about the Jews, the Hebrew people. And what's going on in the area, and why Paul's writing some of the things he writes in these chapters, is the Jews, there's Jewish leaders that are upset because there are Gentiles that claim to know God. Right? There are Gentiles that are saying that they found righteousness in the eyes of God. And the Jewish leaders, the Jews in the area, they're upset about that because what they're thinking in their head is, okay, first of all, God gave us the law. He gave us the prophets. He gave us all these things. And the Gentiles don't have any of that. They haven't even been trying to follow the law. So there's no way they're righteous. And so the Jewish leaders are upset. And that's where Paul is. And that's why he's writing the things that he writes. Because these people are upset. The Jewish people Paul's writing to, we'll see in our main verse in chapter 10, that they have a zeal, but their zeal's misplaced. And Paul's writing it from a perspective that he's been where they are. Right? We know that Paul's been where they are because in Galatians chapter 1, verse 13, this is what Paul says. "For you've heard of my former life in Judaism, how I persecuted the church of God violently and tried to destroy it. And I was advancing in Judaism beyond many of my own age and among my own people. So extremely zealous was I for the traditions of my fathers." See, Romans 9, when Paul opens this up, we can read it with the understanding that Paul knows how they feel. Right? Paul's been there before. Paul has been very zealous for some things. Paul also hated the Gentiles. Right? He was persecuting the Gentiles. But what Paul says is, my zeal was misplaced, and even more so, I was lost. I had not been redeemed. I was very zealous for godly things, but I was lost. And Paul opens Romans 9 and says this, "I have great sorrow and unceasing anguish in my heart, for I could wish that I myself were accursed and cut off from Christ for the sake of my brothers, my kinsmen according to the flesh. They are Israelites, and to them belong the adoption, the glory, the covenants, the law, the worship, and the promises. To them belong the patriarchs, and from their race, according to the flesh, is the Christ who is God over all." Paul says, I love the Israelite people. They're my people. I love them so much, I would do anything that they would come to know Christ. I would do anything for them to realize who Christ is and who God really is, and that they would come to the knowledge of that so that they could be saved. And we're not going to get into all of Romans chapter 9 today, because I could spend weeks in there referencing the Old Testament things that Paul's talking about. And I don't have weeks. I've got one day. So I'm going to just try to give you the context of the chapter so that you can understand what Romans 9 is talking about, because a lot of people will tell you it means a lot of different things. But what's going on here is, in the middle, Paul addresses all those things. He says, look, yeah, I understand. You're God's chosen nation. The prophets were all out of you. And you're the people by which God promised the Messiah would come into the world. You are the people of David and Abraham and Moses, and I get it. I understand that you're proud of those things. But the thing is, God has never failed to fulfill His promises to us, is what He tells us. He's never failed to fulfill His promises to us as His people, the nation of Israel. But even in the past, God didn't always fulfill His promises the way that the Israelite people thought He should have. And that's what Paul's talking about in Romans 9. And he says, but here's the thing, guys. This is what he tells them in 9. He said, here's the thing. God's never failed to fulfill His promises. We haven't always liked the way He's done it, but He's never failed to fulfill it. Never failed to fulfill them. So just because God gave us a bunch of stuff, do you think that means we have the right to question how God does what He does? That's what he says. And at the end of 9, this is how he wraps it up. He says, what shall we say then? That the Gentiles who did not pursue righteousness have attained it? That is, a righteousness that was by faith. But the Israel who pursued a law that would lead to righteousness did not succeed in reaching it. Why? Because they did not pursue it by faith, but as if it were based on works. They have stumbled over the stumbling stone. And Paul says, listen, I know you're upset because these Gentiles are coming to know Christ, and you've been trying really hard to follow the law your whole life, and they haven't. I know you're upset about these things. I know that you feel like you are more deserving of salvation than them because of who you are, being the descendants of Abraham, and all of these things. But here's why you're mad. You're mad because the Gentiles are saying that they have righteousness, even though they haven't done all those things that you've been trying to do, but they're righteous because they recognize who Christ is. And you're not righteous because you stumbled over Jesus. And that's what he's talking about in 9, and that gets us into 10. Paul is writing 9, 10, and 11, even 12, because his goal is to provoke the Jews, right? He's wanting his kinsmen, according to the flesh, to be provoked to the point of jealousy of the Gentiles, so that they will look into these things and come to know Christ. He says that in chapter 11, verse 13. Now I'm speaking to the Gentiles, inasmuch as I am an apostle to the Gentiles, I magnify my ministry in order to somehow provoke my fellow Jews to jealousy, and thus save some of them. So Paul says, I'm writing all this, I'm writing as the apostle to the Gentiles. Yes, that is what God has called me to be. And what I'm writing is proving and magnifying my ministry to the Gentiles and reaffirming it for them. But I'm also writing what I'm writing because I love the Jews. We know Paul loved the Jews because in Acts, when we see Paul going into these towns, every other day of the week, he's out trying to talk to whoever he can. But when it's time for temple worship, where's he at? He's at the synagogue because he wants to reason and witness to the Jews. So Paul loves the Jews, and he wants them to come to know Christ. And I know all that may have seemed like a long way around to get what we're getting in 10, but Romans 9, 10, and 11 are looked at a whole bunch of different ways. But when we look at all of them together, we know what Paul's actually writing about. And this is what he leads into in Romans 10, our passage for this morning, starting in verse 1. Brethren, my heart's desire and prayer to God for Israel is that they might be saved. For I bear them witness that they have a zeal for God, but not according to knowledge. For they, being ignorant of God's righteousness and seeking to establish their own righteousness, have not submitted to the righteousness of God. For Christ is the end of the law for righteousness to everyone who believes. So Paul tells them, look, everything I'm writing to you, all that stuff I just said in the chapter before that probably upset you a little bit, I want you to know that I'm not coming to you self-righteously. Paul says, I'm not coming to you out of pride or arrogance. I'm not coming to you and talking down to you. He says, quite the contrary. I am a Jew. You are my people. And my heart's desire, my genuine desire for you is that you would come to the saving knowledge of Christ. In verse 2, he says, I'm not saying you guys don't know a lot about God. Right? I'm not saying you're not zealous. I'm not saying you don't know a lot. But just like mine was, your zeal is also misplaced. Because it's a zeal that's not according to knowledge. The knowledge of who God is, knowing Him. So he's talking to these people, and these are people that from the outside looked very holy. Right? They looked very righteous. These are people that never missed church. Right? They wore the most godly clothes. These are people that tithed all the time, just like they were supposed to, even more so than they were supposed to. Right? Matthew 23, we know that these are the people that tithed even out of their spice rack. Okay? They were bringing a tenth of their mint and a tenth of their cumin to tithe. These are people that appeared very holy. They were the most committed to Scripture memorization. Most of the Jewish leaders had memorized large portions of the Old Testament, at least the first 5 books, by memory, if not more. They were the most committed to those things. And Paul says, you have a zeal for God, but it's not according to knowledge. See, because their zeal for God was really a zeal for the things of God. Because the things of God could make them look really good. Right? Their zeal for God wasn't according to the knowledge of God. It was just about the things of God. It would make them look good. Just like Paul said about himself in Galatians. What's he say? He says, I was advancing in Judaism. I was even advancing beyond other people my age. I was advancing beyond other people of Israel. They were zealous about the things of God, but not really God, because it was all about making them look good. That's what they've set up, is this system to make them look righteous. And what we see is Paul's addressing who Jesus is with them. That's why he says what he says about Christ being the end of the law. Right? He doesn't say he's the end to the law. I'll talk about that in just a minute. But what Jesus does every time he quotes from the Old Testament law, right? We've been looking at that together in the Ten Commandments with Brother Christian, and we know what the Ten Commandments are, but we also know in Matthew 5, the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus quotes the Ten Commandments. And that's when he says, you've heard it said, but I tell you. And here's the thing, Jesus is not doing away with the law there, right? He says that about himself. He didn't come to abolish the law, he came to fulfill it. So when Jesus is teaching about the law, what he does is he takes what these people have been told by their leaders, and it's been explained to them one way by their leaders, and Jesus says, no, hey look, this is what it's really about. He gets to the bigger point, the bigger picture of the law. Jesus was an expository preacher. He took the Old Testament verses and exposed them to the people. Right? That's what he did, and that's what he always does, and Paul's wanting them to understand that because they've stumbled over Christ. In Deuteronomy 6:5, we read that earlier, that we're supposed to love the Lord with all our heart, all our soul, and all our strength. And then Jesus, he quotes it later and he adds to that. And he says, love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, all your strength, and all your mind. Right? The idea of knowledge is there. And it's not Jesus changing what God had said. He's not changing what God had said in the Old Testament. He's not teaching something different. He's expounding on it for their understanding. And that's why in verse 4, Paul says, for Christ is the end of the law for righteousness to everyone who believes. He doesn't say he's the end to the law. What Paul says is that Jesus is the end of the law, meaning he's completed it. Jesus started following the law and he made it all the way to the end without messing up. Yeah. That's what he says. He's the end of it, not the end to it. And because Christ fulfilled the law, he is righteous before God. Right? Because he's the Son of God and he was able to keep it perfectly and maintain that righteousness because of who he was. He was able to do something we couldn't do. And that's why he says he's the end of the law for righteousness to everyone who believes. But it's a trust in Christ and who he is. And Paul wants them to understand that. Again, he says, I'm not saying you don't have a zeal for God. I'm not saying you don't have an appetite for the things of God. But it's not according to knowledge. Their zeal was not based on who God actually is and who Christ is. They're just like Paul used to be. He was zealous for the traditions of his fathers. And these are men that they were zealous for leaders. They were zealous for the traditions. They were zealous. Their zealousness was according to religion and rules. They looked like the most holy and righteous people on the outside, but they didn't have knowledge and understanding of who God actually was. They knew a lot about God, but they didn't know Him personally. Basically, a kind of a good way to explain it, I guess, is they had a love for a God that they didn't really know. And I want to share a couple analogies with you this morning to maybe help you understand what we're driving at. And the first one I'll share with you right now. There's a man named Sean McDowell, and I listen to him a lot. He's got a couple PhDs and teaches at this big apologetics Christian school in California, Biola University, and it's the Bible Institute of Los Angeles. But he's a very well-known apologist for the Christian faith. Apologetics is just defending your faith. So he's out in town in California, and some college students that obviously don't go to Biola because they don't recognize him, walk up to him and start witnessing. Right? Because he sees them witnessing to other people, and everyone else is ignoring them. And they come up to him and start sharing Jesus with him, and he decides he's going to pretend to be an atheist. All right? So he starts questioning their faith and challenging them and what they're saying and what they're doing. And he says it got to the point where they're just kind of freezing and their eyes are getting real big, and they're just going, they don't know what to do. And he says, I have a confession to make. I'm a Christian. I'm actually a professor at the Christian University here. He said, and they just kind of went, whew. Right, this big sigh of relief. And they said, why would you do that to us? Why would you do that to us? We're out here sharing Jesus. We love God with all our heart. Why would you do that to us? And he says, listen, I'm so proud of you guys. I think it's awesome that you're out here sharing your faith with people. I think it's great that you have a zeal for God and you're out here to do and witness and share all these things. And I have no doubt in my mind that you love God with all your heart. But then he asks them, he said, but do you think that you're loving Him with your mind? And he said they all kind of looked at each other for a minute, and then they got it. It clicked. They understood what he was saying. And they talked some more, and the story goes on, but that's the main part I wanted to share today, because I think it has a little bit to do, at least, if not more so, with what we're talking about. And these are guys that Paul's talking to, that they loved God. Now, they would have said that they loved God with all their strength. They loved Him with all their soul, with all their heart. They would have said those things. They would have given you evidence to prove that they really love God with all their strength and all their soul and all their heart. They would have said, yeah, of course I love God with all my strength. Look at how good I am at fulfilling the law. Of course I love God with all my soul and all my heart. If I didn't love God so much, then I wouldn't be better than all these other people. Right? That's what these leaders of Judaism would have said. If I didn't love God so much, then why am I so much better than everybody else? But were they really zealous for God, or were they zealous for themselves, and therefore zealous for godly things so that they could look a certain way? There's a difference in knowing about God and knowing who He is, knowing Him personally. I'll share another analogy with you, and when I start talking about this person, some of you are going to know who I'm talking about because some of you know him. All right? But I'm not going to say his name, but I don't want to embarrass him over the World Wide Web of world, or whatever. All right? But I have a friend, and he loves Tom Brady. All right? He loves Tom Brady. He can tell you all kinds of statistics about Tom Brady. He can give you all kinds of information about Tom Brady. He has a Tom Brady jersey frame that's hanging in the office at his church. He loves Tom Brady. He cannot talk about Tom Brady without using the phrase GOAT. All right? And I'm not a sports guy to ask him what that meant one time, but he can't do it. He knows so much about Tom Brady. You could say he has a zeal for Tom Brady. But does he really know Tom Brady? Are they personally friends? No, right? Because there's a difference in knowing a lot about a person and actually knowing a person. And these people knew a lot about God, but they didn't know Him. So when we talk about having a zeal for God, a love for God, is the zeal we have according to the knowledge of who He is. Not just knowing a lot about Him, but knowing Him personally, really knowing who He is. Right? There are some of you, people ask me when we go to other places, or we're back home in Sheridan, that there's people down there that know some of you, or if we're out in Carlisle or Lonoke, people ask about knowing some of you. And I know who you are, but we haven't spent a lot of time together. So I know who you are, and I know a little bit about you, but I don't really know you personally because we haven't spent that much time together. I even know some things about you, right? Kind of how tall you are, maybe how you do your hair, how you normally dress. Sometimes they'll describe you to me, and I'm like, yes, that's who we're talking about, the same person, but we haven't spent a lot of time together. And there's a difference in knowing about a person and really knowing them. So when we look at our zeal for God and we evaluate that, we have to understand, is it according to the true knowledge of who they are, or just a bunch of information about the person? Right? Are we talking about the knowledge of who God is, or just information about God? Is our zeal something that pushes us to want to know God more, or is it something that's making us want to make ourselves look better, like what these guys have? And I understand this, okay? Just like Paul, I understand the evaluation of my own zeal. Just like Paul tells these guys, look, I've been there, I get it. I can tell you, I understand what it means to evaluate your own zeal. I'm guilty of these things too. From a personal perspective, sometimes I have to evaluate the motivation behind why I'm doing what I'm doing. Am I reading what I'm reading? Am I listening to the sermons and the seminars I'm listening to? Am I studying the Bible the way I study the Bible because I really want to know God more? It's driving me to know Him more? Or is it because I just want everyone else to think very highly of me? Am I doing the things I'm doing because I want everyone to think that I'm holy and righteous? I want to impress people and say, look at these degrees that I have, or look at this big word that I know. Or is that why I do it? Is it to impress people, or is it because I really, really want to know God more? Sometimes when I get ready to write a sermon or write a lesson, I get halfway through it, and the more I think about it, I think, my motivation in this is not right. My motivation is not right. My motivation is not to try and know God more and stir up in the audience, whether it's the students or it's in here or it's at some conference or revival I'm preaching at. My motivation is not to stir them or stir myself to greater devotion to God. Sometimes my motivation is to get on to somebody or to make other people feel like they're not as good as me. Sometimes my motivation is not what it should be. I can be very zealous in what I'm doing and it be a zeal for godly things and still not be a zeal for God Himself. I understand this from the position of someone that works with other people. Right? I work with teenagers, and is my zeal, is my desire in that ministry, is it just to get a whole bunch of kids here and then make sure that they're outwardly compliant, right? That they act right and talk right and dress right and they know the right answers to the church questions, so that you guys think I look good, so that other people will look and say how great I am, and so that they won't embarrass me when they miss a question or they get in trouble? Is that what I'm really trying to build, or is my desire and my motivation behind what I'm doing because I really want to point them towards Christ? Because I really want to lead them and guide them into a deeper relationship with Him? What is motivating my zeal? Why am I zealous? Am I zealous because I want to look good, or because I want to know God and lead others to know Him? I understand this as a parent. And I know y'all are saying, well, Kinsley's only 3. She's only 3, but I want to get started sooner rather than later. So my motivation with her is my goal is raising her up. Is it that I want her to be happy? Or is my goal for her to be holy? When I'm raising Kinsley, is my goal that she would just act right and never embarrass me in public? Because sometimes those will look the same, right? Teaching godly things will also produce that result. But am I wanting her to just know godly things and act right? Or do I want her to really know them and believe them? And those be true in her heart that she knows where she stands? What's the motivation behind what I do? Do I catch myself, and actually I have caught myself doing this already, to tell her things like, you can't do that in church, quit that. Right? And as she grows up, I want to watch myself. I don't want to tell her, you can't say that in church, or you can't wear that to church. Don't talk like that in front of Brother Christian. Right? I don't want to do those things. But I've already caught myself doing it. I'll already get onto her and say, don't act like that in church. And that's the wrong motivation. That's motivated out of me not wanting her to embarrass me in front of you. Not me wanting her to be set apart and have a desire for God. I want to work on, when I'm raising her, I tell her, listen, not that she can't do it here or there in front of this person or that person, not that she can't wear that to church, but I want my motivation to drive me, my zeal for God, to impact the way I parent. And instead be telling her, this is what the Word of God says in the discussion. At church or not. This is what God says in His Word, and that's the end of it. But I already catch myself doing other things because we have a tendency to care about what other people think about us. And sometimes that gets out of whack. And we become more zealous for that than we are for who God is. Paul says, I'm a witness. These people have a zeal for the things of God, but they don't know God. He says the Gentiles know God, and you guys don't even know God, but you still think you're better than the Gentiles. I don't want to be like that. I want to make sure that my zeal and my motivation is to better know God and not just look better than other people. I want it to help and drive me to help our students in our youth group better know God instead of being motivated by big numbers and just really pretty polished church kids. I want my zeal, the way that I disciple my wife and my daughter, the way that I'm leading in my home as a spiritual leader, to be about investing in their spiritual development, not just, please don't embarrass me. Right? Which I want to talk, because I embarrass them on purpose all the time. But sometimes that motivates the way we parent and the way I lead in my house with my wife and my daughter. Don't do this in front of these people because it will make me look bad. And that's the wrong motivation. And like I just told you, I've been guilty about those things. I sit down to write a sermon and realize the motivation's wrong. Or I listen to a sermon or I read a book and I think, I need to share this with so-and-so. Not because I think that they'll benefit from it and like it. I tell myself that, but really sometimes the motivation is because I want to get on to them for what they did, but I can't say it. But if they listen to Dr. Whoever say it that I just listened to preach, maybe they'll get it. Right? My motivation can be wrong. And I'm sharing those things with you because I want you to understand, I know sometimes when we start evaluating our zeal for God and why we do what we do and our motivation for why we do what we do, sometimes it's hard, and I don't want you to ever feel like I'm preaching at you. I want you to understand I get these things that I'm talking about. I've been there. I've experienced them. And I know that it's hard, but we have to understand that just knowing information about God and knowing who God is not the same thing. And here's what it produces. Verse 3. For they, being ignorant of God's righteousness and seeking to establish their own righteousness, have not submitted to the righteousness of God. Paul says these men were ignorant. That doesn't mean they're uneducated. They're very educated men. Right? They were leaders in Judaism. They were very educated men. But they were still ignorant. Because even though they had the right information, they didn't know what to do with it. Because all that stuff he shares with them in chapter 9 before, about all the prophets they had and all the things that they've seen in the history of their people, all that stuff pointed to Jesus, and they still missed it because they were ignorant of who God is. And they still stumbled. So what they did was, they didn't know who God was. They didn't submit to His righteousness. So what they did was they tried to establish their own. Right? To try and give them some way to make themselves feel righteous. What they did was they made up these rules and they modified their outward behavior. They wanted to look, act, and talk a certain way. And that way they would then be able to look at other people and measure themselves against someone else and say, yep, I'm righteous because I'm better than whoever. That's what was happening. And then they would look at the Gentiles and they'd say, how embarrassing. That's pitiful. They don't know how to act in church. They don't know how to talk in church. That's embarrassing. They don't know the right answers to the right questions. How pitiful are they? I'm so much better than them. That must mean I'm righteous, and they're not. And Paul tells them, hold up, guys. You're the ones that don't know the answers, right? You have the right information, but you can't use it properly because you don't have the proper context. If you know a lot about God, but you don't know who God really is, how do you use the information about God? How do you use it? Just like here, the reason we've looked at all this other stuff around this chapter is because we don't have the right context and we don't know what these verses are talking about. They've stumbled, and he tells them they've not submitted, seeking to establish their own righteousness, have not submitted to the righteousness of God. What this means is because they were ignorant of who God is, and they were trying to set up their own standard, and they were trying to establish their own righteousness, that by default they were also failing to submit to God's authority. Failing to submit to God's authority. And that makes me think for myself, and I hope it does for all of us, that, I realize I have no doubt that I'm zealous. If you said, do you have zeal? Yes, I do. But I have to check and evaluate and see where my zeal is placed. Is it a zeal for God according to knowledge? Is it based on knowing Him more? Is my zeal for God based on what I know about who God is, and I realize who I am, and I recognize how those two things go together? Or is it based on something else? Is what I call a zeal for God or a zeal for God's Word something I do just to justify myself? Is it really a self-righteous zeal? Does it cause me to interpret the Scriptures and my understanding of the Scriptures be based on what God says and His authority? Or am I actually interpreting the Scriptures because of a preconceived notion or idea that I have, and I want the Scripture to justify who I am, so I'm going to twist it and do a little something here and there with it? So instead of trying to make my life fit what God says, I want to make what God says fit my life. That's what these guys were doing that Paul's talking to. Is why I do what I do because I want to please and justify myself, and I just call it a zeal for God even though it's just a zeal for His things, because those things can please me and justify me. Or is my zeal actually a zeal for God, desiring to please Him and please Him and be obedient to Him? That's what the Pharisees were doing. They were twisting things. They were trying to make the Scripture fit them, to make themselves appear more holy. And we do that sometimes. Our motivation's misplaced. Our zeal can be something that looks like it's for God, but in actuality it's not. And what happens is, if my zeal is placed on the wrong thing, I may do the right things, but I'm doing it for the wrong reasons. And because of that, I'm going to be presenting an example to those around me of the wrong things and teaching the wrong things. And my focus when I'm teaching and when I'm raising Kinsley and when I'm trying to lead in my family, when I'm doing those things, because they come from the wrong motivation, they're going to be wrong. They're going to drive home the wrong idea. And then our students that I'm in charge of, they're going to have a zeal based on who I am and a zeal based on who they are, but they're not going to have a zeal based on who God is. My daughter will be taught the wrong things, and she'll have a zeal based on who Daddy is, and she'll have a zeal for herself, but not a zeal based on who God is. Because that's what I've modeled before her if I'm not careful. And I'm getting really close, but I want to share something with you. There's a group of guys that I've been asked to be involved with. And what they're wanting to do is they're wanting to start an apologetics conference. Right? Apologetics being defending the faith. And for teenagers and college students in our state, in the ABA, because as far as we know, we don't have anything like that. And there's other states and other groups that are offering those things to their students, and we thought we should probably try to put something like that together. But we didn't know, what do we cover at this conference? Right? What do we cover at the conference? Because apologetics covers a lot of different things. So we created this survey of a bunch of questions, and some of them don't have anything to do with each other. And we've sent it amongst our churches, and we reached out to other youth pastors and pastors and MBSFs ask them to have their students fill out this survey. And we've asked them to fill out this survey anonymously because we want them to be honest. These are church kids, remember. We want them to be honest. We said, hey, fill it out. Don't put your name on it. We want it to be as anonymous as possible because we don't want you to give an answer just because you think, well, no, you gave it. We want you to give what you really believe. We surveyed, so far we've gotten back around 150 surveys. I'm going to share some of those statistics with you that we found from church kids that walked into a missionary Baptist church, were handed a survey, took the time to fill it out and bring it back. And these are the answers we found. Out of 150 students, right about 70% of them said they did not believe in objective morality. That morality is not the same for everybody. Right around 70% of that 150 said they did not believe in absolute truth. On the issue of abortion, they were split at about 50-50. Around 50% of that 150 that we surveyed said that abortion is at least okay sometimes, that it can be justified. Some of them said it's okay. Some of them said it can be justified, but 50% of them said that sometimes at least it's fine. Around 45% defined marriage as any two people in love, regardless of gender. 62% said that not everything in the Bible is applicable to us today. There are things in there that just don't apply in any way. 55% that it's not important to interpret the Bible literally. That there's good morals and principles in there and lessons that can be taught, but that doesn't mean that it's literal or historically accurate. And this is a small percentage. It's the last one I'm going to share with you today because we got a lot of questions that we asked. But this one scares me because, yeah, it seems like a small percentage. But remember, these are kids that, of their own children, came to a missionary Baptist church, filled this out, brought it back. About just a little over 24% said they do not believe that the Bible is 100% true. It's not 100% trustworthy. These weren't kids that we just randomly went and found at the mall or walking down the street. We didn't go into a public school system and say, here, fill these out. These were students that, at least to some extent, are regularly attending a missionary Baptist church. And as Baptists, we claim that we stand on the truth of the Scripture. They would all be students that we would say have a zeal for God. Right? They know how to act and talk. And if they had known, right, if their youth pastor had walked in and just asked them the question and did it by a show of hands, they probably would have gave the right answer if they knew that it wasn't anonymous. But when they're anonymous and they give their honest answer, they're not submitting to the authority of God. They have a zeal for God, but it's not according to the knowledge of who He is. I read this quote this week by Dr. R.C. Sproul. It says, it's easy for people to believe in the idea of God, just like a kid that has an imaginary friend to give them comfort and hope when things are scary. But it is difficult for most people to believe in a sovereign, just, holy, authoritative God that demands faithfulness and obedience. These guys had a bad idea of who God was. And Paul's addressing it with them, and he's saying, your version of God is a version that glorifies you, not a version of who He truly is that brings Him honor and glory. That's why he says at the end, for Christ is the end of the law for righteousness to everyone who believes. So here's my point. Right? And Paul says, look, I know you people would say you love God, and I know you people know a lot about God. Y'all go to church and you do all the right things. But you don't know Him. And you're not really loving Him with all your heart, soul, strength, and mind. You don't really know who He is. And here's what's happening. What they're trying to do, these people that we are reading about that Paul's addressing, they're trying to take who God is and make Him fit them. And those surveys scare me because the same thing is kind of happening there with our own students in the ABA from all across the state. Right? These are churches all over the place, spread out. And it worries me And that's what they're trying to do. And here's what they're saying. They're saying, God, you should save me. I've earned it. I deserve it because of who my ancestors were. But don't save those people. Even though I'm refusing to submit to your authority and I'm not recognizing who Christ is, I deserve to be saved and the Gentiles don't. Because I have modified my behavior and my speech in such a way that makes me righteous. But according to 2 Corinthians 5, has their heart been transformed? Or just a couple of chapters later in Romans 12, is their mind being transformed? They're just trying to justify their own thoughts and opinions. That's what the Pharisees were doing. And we see that happening within our own work. And Paul's going to provoke them out of that mindset. He says, use your mind. Logically reason with what you know about the Scriptures. And you will come to see that all that stuff that God gave you pointed to Jesus and you've missed it. Use your mind and reason about this. Because I want you to come to know Christ. And that's what I read this morning, Romans 10:8-13. He says, you guys know the Word. You know. Use your mind. Think about what you know about who God is from the Old Testament. He says, but what does it say? The Word is near you. It's in your mouth and in your heart. It's the same gospel that I'm proclaiming, right? It's the faith that we proclaim. If you confess with your mouth that Jesus is Lord, believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, you'll be saved. For with the heart one believes and is justified, and with the heart one believes and is justified, with the mouth one confesses and is saved. And then he says at the end, for everyone who calls on the name of the Lord will be saved. He wants them to be saved. And let me tell you, I'm not saying that because those students got the wrong answer, I'm not saying that they're lost. But what I am saying is their zeal is misplaced. They're loving a God they do not know and they do not submit to. And here's why those scare me, and I'm wrapping it up with this. They scare me as an individual because I want to check and make sure that what I'm doing is driving other people towards Christ, not just modifying their behavior or outward compliance. They scare me as a minister and as a parent. That are the children I've been given authority over, a position over, most of all my own daughter. Am I leading her to Christ? Am I raising her in a way that is helping with her spiritual development? Am I asking her to be obedient and honoring and pleasing to God, or am I just concerned about her being obedient and pleasing to Daddy? I saw those things and they worried me. Because I think they would know the right church answer. But when they were able to be anonymous, they didn't give a biblical answer. And when I think about raising up my own daughter, I think about this. Do I want her to be obedient and respectful and submit to Dad's authority? Yes. But if that's all it is, right, she can have a zeal for Daddy and be honoring Daddy and submitting to Daddy and give Daddy the answers Daddy wants, and still not be honoring God in her heart. So more than being obedient and honoring to Daddy, I want to teach her to be obedient and honoring to God. And you say, well, God tells you to be obedient and honoring to you. Yes, He does, but here's the thing. She can honor Daddy and not be honoring God in her heart. But if she's truly trying to honor God and submit to His authority and follow Him, part of that is honoring Dad. She cannot be honoring and submitting to God without honoring and submitting to me, but she can honor and submit to me and not be honoring and submitting to God. So the point of all this is, where's our zeal? What's our zeal for? Is it for God because of who He is and realizing that we are not righteous and we are sinners and what He has done for us, that we can be redeemed, that we've placed our faith in Christ and we trust God and His Word? Or is our zeal for a God we don't really know? Right? And maybe, I'm not saying that if you don't know those things, you're not saved. That's not what I'm saying. But sometimes I think we have this tendency that we get saved and we get baptized and then our walk stops there. Are we really zealous for God? Is our zeal for the right reasons? So this morning I want to ask you, evaluate those things. I evaluate them for myself, and sometimes I don't like what I find, but I've got to be honest with myself, because unless I realize where I've messed up, I cannot correct course, right? But also, if you're here this morning and you heard a lot today, even in what we read, where Paul talks about believing in Christ, having faith in Christ. All who call upon the name of the Lord will be saved. Believe in your heart, all those things. And you've never really come to know who Jesus is. You've heard a lot about Jesus. Now, you've been at church and you've heard a lot about Him, but you've never really come to understand that it's because of His righteousness that you can be saved. Because you have no righteousness of your own that amounts to anything. And you need to place your faith in Him today. I ask you to come do that this morning. Let's pray.